Thanks for pressing play on another edition of Another Dolphins Podcast. We are less than a week away from the start of the 2025 new year. That means we are less than a week away from legal tampering beginning across the NFL. Talk of the town, the Miami Dolphins are desperately in need of offensive linemen, so we are continuing our free agent preview this week. Eric Smith, the offensive line guru, 5 Reason Sports contributor, is joining us today to dive into every single possible option, almost every single possible option for the Miami Dolphins. But before we get into all that, before we get into some recent news around the NFL, Eric, what's going on, man? It's good to see you.
Hey, appreciate you guys having me on. This is I don't want to say a slow part of the year, but this is kind of where everything kind of the grinding just kind of gets old of, watching a bunch of players both through free agency and the draft that unfortunately we're probably not going to talk about after a couple of weeks, but we are getting close to that point where we're going to, start to sign a few players and really have some guys to talk about that, that'll be on the team. And, maybe some of those guys will be ones that we talk about today.
I think it's funny you say the down part of the year, right? Because, just look around. Today trades are coming around. We got DK Metcalf on the trade block, guys getting cut. So football really does feel like it never sleeps, but it is the slow part of the offseason. So as we get near that tampering period, like Jake said, they're going to fill some holes on the offensive line. And glad to have you on here, that beautiful beard on here to talk about the offensive line group. Because as we know, the Dolphins desperately need some guards, if not more than that.
We are going to get into some soon-to-be free agents, but Eric, just today, the Bears have traded a couple days ago, the Bears traded a 2025 sixth-round pick to the LA Rams for Jonah Jackson, a guard who is set to make $17.5 million in 2025, and they weren't done. Ben Johnson is not messing around. They also traded a 2026 fourth-round pick to the Chiefs for all-pro offensive lineman Joe Thuney, who is set to make $16 million in 2025. Now, I need you all to keep in mind here, $16 million and $17.5 million. So, Eric, when you have those two numbers in your mind, combined with a sixth-round pick for a pretty great guard or a fourth-round pick for a pretty great all-pro guard, what goes through your mind?
I think the Bears are doing a really good job of rebuilding that line quickly. I don't know. I haven't watched a whole lot of Jonah Jackson recently, but I do know that he, did really, really well with the Lions when Ben Johnson was there. So I think there's, some hope that he's going to have a bit of a resurgence back under that same offense there. Obviously, some risk involved there. As far as the Tooney side, I think that's a win-win for both teams in the sense that they paid Tooney a huge contract to come there originally when they were rebuilding that line. He's been a great piece of that offensive line. But as we get into the next phase of that rebuild for their offensive line, they're now, paying Creed Humphrey big money. They just franchise tagged Trey Smith. It's hard to have a third guy in the interior making that much. He's on the last year of his deal. I don't think there was any dead cap left with trading him and getting rid of him for the Chiefs. So it's an opportunity for them to move on from a player who was entering the last year of his contract. At his age, they're probably not looking to bring him back. So might as well get some draft capital for him as they transition to their next, phase of the offensive line. And then for the Bears, Tooney is still a good player. I know he got beat up in the playoffs, especially in the Super Bowl, but that was at tackle. He's still a good guard, and he's the type of player, kind of like Teron Armstead was for the Dolphins, that can come in at the front end of that rebuild and be that veteran presence, teach those guys how to do it the right way. You've got that championship pedigree. So, he knows what it takes, and he can, for the next year, can, get those guys going in the right direction. I think that's a win-win for both of those teams.
Josh, when you saw these notifications go across your phone, were you just like shaking your hands in there? Like, Chris Greer, why are you sleeping? What's going on here? Why aren't the Dolphins making these moves?
Yeah, I don't know that I was. I didn't even look up their salary until we started doing the rundown. But had I seen that, I'd be like, okay, I kind of understand why. Like Eric said, and it kind of feels like one of those things with the Chiefs, right? They're almost getting ahead of it there with Tooney. Like maybe his best football might be behind him. Jonah Jackson, good on Ben Johnson, though. My first impression was honestly like his little stint in Miami was enough to show him how important the offensive line means and how, that's the first thing they attack. So I like the moves for the Bears. I wasn't really shaking my fist, but I did notice a lot of people, Chris Greer's sleeping, this, that, and and the other thing. And I had to mention, they're getting paid a lot of money this year. You had to give the draft capital, which wasn't a lot. And I think we could all agree these guys, I'd be intrigued to see them in this offense, but it wasn't right for the Dolphins. Hat tip to Ben Johnson, though, for, seeing the need there and building that front for Caleb Williams.
When you can think about or envision a world where the Dolphins have maybe a second-round rookie starting at guard this year, there's such a big jump from that to $17.5 million, where I totally understand just trying to settle down, don't get too ahead of the game here. There's a reason all these guys are on the trade block, and that's not to say neither Joe Thuney or Jonah Jackson would improve the Dolphins, but they have a lot of needs here, and you got to have a really well thought out plan as the pieces of the offensive line start to come together for you, Eric. I think it's a little interesting. I think we heard Kendall Lamb's actually been working out, and he's actually thinking about coming back for another season, even though he said that last year was his last ride. Liam Eichenberg, he's a free agent. Isaiah Wynn, we saw what he could do a little bit near the end of the season. And then Robert Jones, who's been the Dolphins need guards, but for a backup, I never thought was too bad. When you look at just those four guys who are about to enter free agency, expect to see any of those names in aqua and orange again next year?
Any of them? I mean, maybe one. I think they'll probably move on from Kendall Lamb. I think that what we saw last year from him was just not good enough in this offense, even as a swing tackle. You got Paul and Jackson. I think it's a good opportunity to bring in a little bit of new blood there to compete with Keon Smith. Is that swing tackle type player on the interior? They obviously have to, reinvent that entire room. But that, reinvent it from a starting perspective, right? You could bring back Wynn as a guy that could play either side. And, when you're not asking him to start, then, you're not risking him for an entire season, which everybody knows he's not going to make it that long. I know that nobody would want to see it, but, if they were to re-sign Eichenberg as like your 8th or 9th guy on the roster, like, I know a lot of people want to say he's the worst offensive lineman in the league, and that's just not true. Like, shouldn't be starting for us. I'm not going to argue that at all. But when you look at all the backups across the league, you can do way worse as somebody that would have to come in and, middle of the game emergency type situation. And he fills a lot of roles for you. So would I bring him back? No, but I definitely think I could see a scenario where, one of these guys comes back, but I don't think that we're going to see any of these guys back in a starting role, which, should please everybody.
Yeah, that's music to my ears. And I mean, I kind of kept using the Liam Eichenberg and kind of comparing him to Jesse Davis, right? He's like that 6th offensive lineman that can come in. I'd be okay with that as well. You mentioned Isaiah Wynn. Is that kind of where you would lean out of these guys? I mean, Kendall Lamb, you mentioned he's probably not going to resign. If you had to choose, I mean, salary kind of, equal and not really an issue here. Is there one of those guys you'd prefer over the other? Would Isaiah Wynn be that guy you'd rather bring back than a Robert Jones or Liam Eichenberg?
I've always had a thing for Rob Jones. I really thought that he was going to come in. I thought that he was going to have a better season this past year, replacing Rob Hunt than what he did. He did suffer a shoulder injury early in the year, which, based on the way that I graded it, I felt like that was a big factor early in the year. And I thought that he kind of steadied out as the season went on. I wouldn't say that he made the growth that I had hoped that he would make as a starter. So I'm not, going to sit here and advocate for him to come back as a starting guard. But, heading into last season, Rob Jones was my top guard out of the guys that we had coming back. So if we're talking about the ones that I would, talk about returning again, I think that, Liam Eichenberg has that center versatility, but I think, we have Andrew Meyer who's on the roster. So I don't think they're going to, if we didn't have somebody like Andrew Meyer, the staff clearly values, then that may be more of a, a priority for them to find somebody that had that much scheme versatility. But if we're just looking for somebody that can come in and can play left or right guard, Jones, well, all of them have done it. But my choice out of all of those guys would probably still be Jones, but it's pretty much interchangeable.
Keon Smith and was a name that the Dolphins brought up in the end of season press conferences, and same with Andrew Myers. So I'm glad that you brought both of them up. This might be a bit of a dumb question, but just to kind of wrap up the thoughts on the Dolphins last year. I mean, Connor Williams, he was, I think, 6'4"-ish, maybe 6'3". Liam Eichenberg was playing center at 6'6". So when you're talking about, I don't want to use ascension, but like growth from players at guard, like a Robert Jones or a Lee Meikenberg. Do you think that going all the way from like that 6'4", 6'5" center to Aaron Brewer, like I still have a hard time when I read that he's 6'1"? Like, is that difference? Does that change anything for the guys playing guard? Because I do wonder if that had a role in Miami's inability to get 1 yard at times, like some of those stone walls up the middle. I just wonder if Aaron Brewer, I think, is a good center, but you just kind of got to shift your focus a little bit when your center is 6'1".
Yeah, I agree with that. And it is a pretty big difference. That's why you don't see many offensive linemen across the NFL that are 6 foot. Now, if you're going to have a 6 foot offensive lineman, center's where you're going to want that. And Aaron Brewer is a great fit for what the Dolphins have done over the last couple of years. And that's a big reason that I don't see the transition to the inside zone stuff that a lot of people have been pushing for, because it doesn't fit Aaron Brewer, who was, in my opinion, their best offensive lineman last year. It doesn't fit Devon Achan. So if you start to go to an inside zone type thing, I think you're really limiting the effectiveness of two of the best players on your offense. But when we're talking about that outside zone stuff, where we're not asking Brewer to get movement on a 0 or a 1 technique, I think you can mask that lack of size there. But it does show up at times, especially with the inside stuff. I would say that going from Connor Williams to Aaron Brewer at center was a much um, lower on the list of issues than losing Austin Jackson and Teron Armstead at times. Um, Even though we're running to the inside, a lot of those runs, and the tight ends, like a lot of those inside runs were stopped because of stuff that was coming off the edges and able to make plays or squeeze the gaps. So I feel like that was a bigger issue than Aaron Brewer versus Connor Williams.
One last question before we wrap it up. What do you wrap up the current state of the Miami Dolphins offensive line? I should say. What is your thoughts on Patrick Paul? I know Teron Armstead still, weighing whether or not he's going to return. How'd you like, when you dove into the tape with Patrick Paul? Are you confident that he can be that, not so much of a drop off from a Teron Armstead? As crazy as that might sound.
I mean, you're going to have a drop off on the field. Teron Armstead, when he is on the field, is still one of the top tackles in the NFL. And Patrick Paul is not that. But Patrick Paul is on the field. So while I think that you would have a drop off from a performance perspective, I think that, we always talk about the offensive line as an entire cohesive unit. And I think that even though your performance at left tackle may not be as high as when Teron Armstead is on there, I think that the continuity that you will have by having Paul there for hopefully 17 or more games, I think the entire unit is going to benefit from that more than you would from, Teron Armstead in and out of the lineup. And Patrick Paul as a player, I didn't feel like he was as big of a project as a lot of other people felt like coming out of the draft. And that carried over to the season. I think he flashed a lot. There's obviously still room to improve. You don't draft a guy in the second round and drop him in at left tackle and not have any growing pains.
Mhm.
But I think that he showed enough that I'm confident in his ability to play left tackle. And I had said even before the Teron restructure that regardless of what Teron does, I'm ready to move on from Teron and move into the Patrick Paul era.
Less than a week away from free agency, Chris Greer admitted he is finally worried about the offensive line. The Dolphins have obviously made their plans crystal clear. Mike McDaniel at the Combine talking about in free agency during the draft, we are going to be focused on the offensive line. And Eric, Josh, you both have been Dolphin fans longer than I, but I mean, what? The entire 2010s, it felt like that first day of legal tampering. It was the Dolphins get the number one wide receiver in Mike Wallace. They get the number one defensive tackle in Ndamukong Suh. They're always winning free agency. And there is so much money being thrown around, and it doesn't seem to work for the Dolphins. So, Eric, when I started going through this list, and shout out Greg Rosenthal, NFL Daily, NFL Network, I kind of took his list of 101 top free agents and just kind of cut to the chase with the offensive linemen. Who would be the favorites to come to Miami? Who would make the most sense for Miami? And I didn't have to scroll far to find that first lineman. Number 2 on the list, was Trey Smith of the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, Eric, he did get franchise tagged, but this was a name that was talked about by a lot of Dolphin fans. So I just kind of wanted to get your perspective here. And when you see, these other offensive linemen getting moved for big money, you wonder, are the Miami Dolphins missing out?
I don't think so. I was never on board with the huge contract that Rob Hunt got, and I'm not sure that there would be a guard across the NFL that I would do that for. Maybe a Quentin Nelson in his prime. And as good as Trey Smith is, there was definitely times in the playoffs where you could see with him that he's not a perfect player by any means either. He had some struggles in pass pro in the playoffs. I don't think that in terms of a outside zone run scheme, I don't think he's a ideal fit for that. He does a lot of things good and he does some things really great. He's going to have some pancakes, some flashy plays. But I think that when you go and you sign a guard to a $20 million per year contract, you know, for me, it's got to be somebody that those plays are almost non-existent, right? It's a clean slate across the board, and I don't feel like Trey Smith is necessarily that player. So it wasn't a big deal for me to see him get franchised and not be an option for the Dolphins.
Yeah, and I don't know that anybody should have had realistic expectations that the Dolphins would swing that type of, value, put that type of value on a guard, because let's be honest, they haven't yet. So I was not surprised, I guess, that the Chiefs, put that tag on him, but then that keeps him in-house, and I guess they get to sit there and, offer him whatever somebody else might. So good on them, but I think I agree with you. Other than Quentin Nelson in his prime, I don't know what guard would even stand out.
When I started looking at this list, might be a little bit of a homer here, but Trey Smith, 26 years old, he was going to be the top player on the market, and he's a very good player. Was it this easy to point out an issue with Robert Hunt? Like, I'm just wondering, like, where would you rank him in terms of the free agent linemen this year? Because, man, as we go through this list, there are going to be a lot of players who do have some warts. Players who have warts are often the ones who hit free agency. I'm looking at Robert Hunt and how he was with the Dolphins and how he's been with Carolina, and I wonder, like, is he like one of the rare ones where you don't necessarily have those warts? Somebody who could just go from one team to another and just kind of be awesome?
In my opinion, a lot of the stuff that I said for Trey Smith would hold true for Rob Hunt also. If you go
Fair.
back and you really watch him on a play-by-play basis, particularly in pass protection, he had some ugly losses. I saw that I think that somebody had gone out and posted that, he hadn't given up a sack all year with the Panthers. And there was people that were saying, well, he didn't give up a sack, but how many pressures did he give up?
Mhm.
So, when you isolate certain stats and you can make a player look one way or the other, for me, like I said, it was a lot of the same stuff in the sense that, I felt that Rob Hunt was not a perfect prospect as a pass protector. Definitely got movement in the run game, but there's guys again that we'll talk about today that have better movement skills when we're looking at that outside zone stuff than what Rob Hunt did. So again, I was not disappointed at all to see him leave. I would have liked to see him return, but it would have been more like a 10 million a year contract, which obviously, wasn't even the same stratosphere when that contract came in.
$100 million for Robert Hunt. It's just good for him, man. Good for him.
Yeah.
You had to open up that wound, though. I mean, other than that, I mean, like you said, it would have been so nice to bring him back, but there's no way in no world could you have done that. That's crazy.
One team that has been known for having a great offensive line in recent years is losing a couple players this offseason. Eric, let's start with Will Freeze, one of the most improved young guards in all of football. He broke his tibia in week 5. He allowed 2 sacks in the first 5 games of the season. He's only allowed 4 sacks over the last season as well. So 6 total sacks in 2 seasons. How would you see as him being a fit for the Miami Dolphins?
So I had him as my number 4 guard overall in free agency. And as I went through and I created my list, I created just an overall list. And then I kind of went back and I feel like, looking back over the way that the Kyle Shanahan 49ers have filled the guard positions in the way that the Dolphins have so far, I feel like there's a different criteria for both of them. where you see on the left side, you see that 325, 330-pound guy that can create movement, can win in short area quickness. Whereas on the right side, you got a guy that's a little lighter, is able to get in space a little better, able to, cut off that three technique if you're running outside to their play side. And I think that right side guard is where Will Fries really fits for me. He wins with quickness, a top level athlete for an offensive lineman. Not the most powerful guy, but I think he's still capable. I think that he is the best fit for the Dolphins in free agency for right guard. Um, and I don't like we talk about the contracts of the guys the Bears just got in Jonah Jackson and Joe Tooney. And I think that Fries could be a player that comes in that range as well. And that's a player that I would pay in that range to basically replace the Liam Eichenberg right guard position.
Man, that's awesome. I'm intrigued to hear more about Will Fries. I looked it up. Spotrac has 14.1 million annually as the salary, so I think you're right with him potentially making that much. He started 31 games for the Colts. He was drafted as a tackle, then moved inside. And I looked up his PFF grade because Jake supports PFF, and I will try to use as much as I can. Overall, 86.9. That was fourth among all guards, and then finished with a 74.9 pass block and an 84.9 run block. So definitely someone I'm intrigued by. And for you to sit here and say that you would pay him that, and you feel like he'd be the perfect fit for this offense. I mean, I was a little bit hyped on him when I saw Penn. I remembered him from Penn State, but I'm a little bit hyped on him now after hearing more about him.
My only gripe, and it's not with him specifically, a 2021 7th round pick. I just wonder, can there be some sort of middle ground between like $15 million and like a 7th round, like undrafted rookie? I completely understand he's not the player he was when he first got out of college, but I do think this is a position that if the Dolphins, if you have a general manager who's been doing this for a couple of years, which I think the Dolphins do, you would, as you're talking about the different traits, you'd really kind of identify a couple traits from a different couple players where you could say, all right, let's make this work. That's like my only gripe here is, man, with all these different issues, can you really afford $14 million on a guard who's coming off a pretty tough injury? Speaking of guards, I want to get your thoughts on Teven Jenkins, because I think he might, doing a very, very, very quick read. He is someone who I thought was pretty interesting just because we could go with the Butch Berry mantra, and Butch Berry, we trust, somebody who kind of had some hiccups throughout his career. He's 27 years old, but had strong draft pedigree, and I'm not willing to give up on someone who had to deal with being a Chicago Bear for 4 years.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a guy that you might not look at as being a guy that would definitely hit free agency. I think there was, some rumors that the Bears could be interested in bringing him back, but now with them getting Jackson and Tooney, pretty much writing on the wall for him to leave. There's a lot of guys who I respect who, have gone back and watched the film for Jenkins, and they are not as high on him anymore. I am not in that boat. He was one of the first guards that I looked at. And like I said, I see a different mold for the left versus the right guard. For me, he is the ideal left guard in this offense, the 330-pound guy. I think he's 6'6" or, in that range. He's definitely not, a short guard. He still an elite athlete, right? You're talking about a big man that moves well. And, I can see why he was moved inside, because he, still has some issues in pass protection, still some, mirroring issues. But when you talk about him being able to get out and run and be able to cut off a 3 technique or cut off a one technique for the backside, this guy's still really athletic, still plays with really good power. And like you said, he's played for the Bears for the last 4 or 5 years, whatever it was. So not a player that I would say has reached his ceiling. I think early in the off season, there was discussions of his contract getting up into that 15-20 million dollar range. I haven't heard that recently, and that's not where I would be on him. But this is another player that I would, be willing to invest a quality amount into, right? I'm not going to sit here and say I would only pay him $3 million. But, getting up into that $8 to $10 million range. The biggest question for me with Jenkins is obviously the injury part of it.
Right.
He's got his own injury history, and I've said from the beginning that my biggest goal for the Dolphins in 2025 is going to be to find that continuity on the offensive line. I think they can sustain a little more variation at the guards. But if you're talking about Jenkins and somebody else who is similar in terms of performance, but the other guy is more healthy, I'm going to take the more healthy guy every time because I'm tired of going through these revolving doors of offensive lines.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. That's kind of Chris Grier's MO, right? He's okay giving some of these guys that have been injured and have the history an extra chance. So I can definitely see where you're coming from with that. Started 38 games with the Bears. You mentioned his salary between 8 to 10. Spotrac, take it with a grain of salt, but it had at 10.3 million annually as his market value. So you're right around in that ballpark. You did mention a different vision for the left side as the right side at guard. Could you explain that a little bit for us? Dumb it down for some of our listeners and explain what you're trying to look for between those two positions.
Well, I mean, really, it's just looking at what the 49ers and what the Dolphins have done over the last, what is it, 9, 10 seasons, or, 7 years, I guess, is what Shanahan's been with the Niners for. But you go back and look at the left guard position, and as soon as Shanahan got to the 49ers, he went and traded for Laken Tomlinson.
That's
And
right.
that's a player that, if we sit here and, typically if you say outside zone, you're thinking about the Denver Broncos type offensive line. Laken Tomlinson is not the type of guard that you think about at all. And then, they get through the Laken Tomlinson contract. They draft Aaron Banks to play left guard. And that's another 6'5", 330-pound guy playing on the left side. And then you bring it to what the Dolphins did this year, trying to put Rob Jones there, who's another, was he 6'4", 6'5", 320, 330-pound player. So that left guard just feels to me like they want that heavier player that, might not be as good in space, but wins with the short area quickness. Now you go to the right side, and I think the heaviest, actually, I think Pooney might be a little heavier than the guys they've had in the past, but almost all of those guys have been like 310 or less. So you're getting a lighter, better mover on the right side. Um, and I don't know, maybe that might be nothing. It's just that you know the way that those positions have had different players playing at each of them on the left and the right side just feels like it might be something to me.
I think you're 100% onto something. And one of there's been some bright spots of the McDaniel era, but the ability to identify the traits they want at center. Connor Williams was a left guard. Aaron Brewer was an everything, right? I think he had starts at every single position along the offensive line. I wanted to bring up Josh Myers just because, you're mentioning that body type, 6'5", 310 pounds. He actually has played over 3,000 snaps at center over the last 4 years for the Green Bay Packers. But just thinking about LaFleur, another member of that Shanahan system, I wanted to get your thoughts, maybe not Myers specifically, but that idea of you have those top tier guards who are going to get paid a lot. Could the Dolphins maybe find someone like this who's played center for 4 years and all of a sudden say, all right, we see these traits, maybe you're going to be a guard for us. And this is a way Spotrac has him at 14 million. So it might not be a cost cutting measure for Myers specifically, but just maybe that type of player, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I could see that. The I guess the part that I don't think would work out would be that from Josh Myers' perspective, I feel like most teams across the league are going to pay a center more than they're going to pay a
Great point.
guard. So I'm not sure that he would get the same offers from the Dolphins or from somebody else to come in and play guard. I think that, he is a good player. I don't think he stands out in any way, but I think that he's one of the few centers that I would say are very scheme versatile, right? He can
Mhm.
come in and he can be effective in an outside zone scheme like the Dolphins run. He can come in and he can be effective in, let's say, the Baltimore Ravens with more of a power scheme. Um, so if I had to pick across the NFL, a center that was above average in any scheme, I think that Josh Myers would be pretty high on that list. I'm not saying that I would take him over Aaron Brewer in our offense because I like what they ask Aaron Brewer to do. I like the way that they use him, and Josh Myers can't do some of that, but he can do stuff that Aaron Brewer can't do. And I think that the stuff that Josh Myers does would translate to guard also. So if he was open to that, it would certainly be something that I would explore. But I just feel like in terms of contract offers that he's going to get, he's likely going to get a better offer to stay at center than we'd be able to offer to transition to guard.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I don't really have much to piggyback on that. 56 games he played with the Packers. 14 million annually is what market value was from Spotrac. So I think he'll probably sign with a team that needs a center, but I can see why the intrigue would be there if he was open to moving it to guard. I mean, he could probably play position very well.
This is probably the most interesting one because after the Bears made a couple moves, I thought he was going to follow Ben Johnson to Chicago, but Kevin Zeitler at 35 years old, man, I know what everyone's yelling at their radios. You want to draft a lineman, you want some younger guys, but he's played at least 950 snaps in every single season dating back to 2015. 29 sacks allowed over his 13-year career. This guy sounds like the offensive Calais Campbell, if I'm being completely honest with you. And on top of that, you want to pitch for the Dolphins? He's played in Cincy, Baltimore for 4 years, the Giants for 2 years. He's been in Cleveland. Dude, why not come hang out in Miami for these final 2 years, something like that? I think I can put together a really interesting case here that Kevin Zeitler could be an interesting prospect for the Dolphins.
I actually really like that Calais Campbell analogy because looking over the notes that I have for Zeitler, kind of see him in the same light, a player that was really good for a really long time and is still a good player, but you can see that the athleticism, is kind of starting to wane. He's not the same type of player. I think that he would be a better fit for a team that really did want to go to run that inside zone type stuff. And if that's the direction the Dolphins want to go, then he would be a good fit for that. The biggest problem that I have with Zeitler is the age. I mean, you're talking about a guy that you're probably only getting for a year, maybe two. And that wouldn't be my plan A going into the off season, to find a guy who is only going to be here for a year or two, and then we're trying to, fix the offensive line again in 2026. But the way that I see Zeitler, and if, again, we use the Calais Campbell analogy, Zeitler decides that he doesn't want to rush into a contract. He wants to wait and see what's available. Zeitler would be the type of player that, if we go through free agency and, maybe the guards are just astronomically priced, and when we look at what Alex Kappa got, that's not out of the realm of possibility because he got more than I thought that he would. If you get into the draft and, the guys that you want don't fall to the positions where you want to get them, so you get through the free agency and the draft and you don't have your guard positions filled, then that would be the time that I would like to see somebody like a Zeitler picked up on a 1-year stopgap type thing. Maybe he's not the athlete that we want in this system, but that he's going to come in there and he's going to anchor well. He's not going to give up pressures, and he's just going to be a solid force in there.
I like that. Almost using him as that break in case of emergency. We kind of saw it with Odell Beckham, right? They were kind of talking to him before. That did not work out by any stretch of the imagination. But you know what I mean? They have him in their back pocket where, last season he ranked 5th among all guards according to Pro Football Focus and the 6.8. Again, he's 35, but how much, long term are you really looking if you're Chris Greer and them? They might be okay with just bringing in a guy who they know can set and forget and can, play well in this, with the rest of this offense. So intriguing name, but I think I'd like to see them go a little bit younger. 9.2 million annually according to Spotrac market value.
Barry Jackson of the Miami Herald reported that the Dolphins are still undecided on Bradley Chubb, but if the Dolphins, I think I'm against it. I think if you want to have a super unit on defense, I think that include having Bradley Chubb. But if you wanted to release him post June 1st cut, that's a way to open up $20 million that you're not going to be using right away in free agency. So if you wanted to, remake the movie Grown Ups in early July with like Teron Armstead, Zeitler, and then Calais Campbell, you can definitely do that. One name who I think is going to be, I could see Chris Greer falling in love with him, former Philadelphia Eagle, Reclamation Project. what would your thoughts be if the Dolphins gave Mekhi Becton like a 3-year deal? I mean, the cap's gone up a bunch, but like an Eric Flowers, I remember I think he was a player. He moved inside with Washington. Dolphins gave him a 3-year deal and then released him shortly after. But neither here nor there, I guess.
I am not a very big fan of Mekhi Becton. I wasn't huge on him coming out. I didn't feel that he moved well. Um, Obviously, didn't succeed at tackle for the Jets. He went to the Eagles and had a good season. You know, I know that PFF graded him very well, probably better than I would have viewed him. I still saw some of the same issues that he had as a tackle at guard, particularly in pass protection when he was asked to play in space. I mean, he's got the benefit of just being massive. So when you move him into guard, it's a little easier to hide some of that. But my worry with Mekhi Becton is that he is playing for the Eagles on a line that basically has 4 other Pro Bowlers around him. Like you could send Liam Eichenberg there, and people are going to say that he had a resurgence with the Eagles as well. Um, so I would be worried with Mekhi Becton that when you take him out of that environment and he's no longer the number 5 player on your offensive line, but he's viewed as the 2 or 3, that the stuff that still exists there would be magnified, and I think that would not go over well.
You heard it here first. If Liam Eichenberg goes to the Eagles and he has just an absolute resurgence, Eric was all over that. I mean, I think last year for our listeners, that have not a Dory brain like me, I think I even mentioned maybe signing Mekhi Becton. I didn't know if he can play inside, but like you mentioned, he played inside on a very good Eagles offensive line. So I'd be a little bit concerned with paying him that hefty contract that he's probably going to get. And I just don't know how it would work out, like you said, because he was having some of those deficiencies masked being behind one of the best offensive line. But 26 years old, I mean, it's nice to see a player that, again, didn't work out 30 games at tackle for the Jets, but looked very good last year at guard, again, with a bunch of good players around him.
You're never your best when your highest isn't your high and your lowest isn't your low. Like that's something I want to keep in mind when I say this. But he was drafted as a left tackle. As a rookie, 7 penalties and 7 sacks allowed. Last year, with all this growth, stepping in at right guard, still 5 sacks and 5 penalties. Those are some pretty big mistakes here that I do think that might just be that being drafted by the Jets. Maybe that's doing it to him. We'll have to see about that one. Eric, I'm going to break down the fourth wall for a quick second. I didn't ask you how long you had. I have 3 more guards listed here. Do you got to take off anytime soon? Are you in a rush at all?
No, I'm good for as long as you need me.
Awesome. Then let's talk James Daniels. He's played more than 1,000 snaps in each season from 2021 through 2023, but coming off a torn Achilles, is this a player that maybe the Dolphins, you see those guys getting tens of millions of dollars to play guard? Is James Daniel maybe one of those second, third tier options who could be available?
So James Daniels is a funny one for me because one, the injuries obviously are a concern. But the bigger thing for me is that there's a lot of guys that I respect a lot. I respect their opinions that are really high on James Daniels, and I just can't get on board. Like I watch this guy play, and I know that he's listed at 320, but he doesn't look like a 320-pound player. It looks like he's a very good athlete. But in my opinion, he has some serious issues dealing with power.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how we can continue to go with guys that have that issue. Both in the pass game and the run game. And like I said, there's a lot of people that I respect that feel differently. So maybe I'm just way off base on this one. But for me, with James Daniels, there's just too many issues dealing with power for me to like him in that sense. I mean, this would be a player that, if you told him that we could get him on a lower end contract, he's got center experience also, and this was going to be our utility interior guy as a backup, then I would be completely on board with it. But, based on the way that others talk about him, and I'm not sure what the projected contract is, but it's probably not looking like a backup type player. So I don't know what it is other than, like I said, the lack of ability to deal with power that I'm seeing, but I am lower on James Daniels than a lot of guys that I talk to.
That's definitely a concern if you're watching this tape and you're concerned with power. I mean, I do have it up at 7.8 million annually according to Spotrac. So again, a lot more than a backup might make. 84 games started in 7 seasons, 38 with the Bears, 36 with the Steelers. Looks like he's better in run blocking than pass protection, according to PFF. You probably have your own opinion on that. 92.9, so he was the second rated guard in all of football. Again, PFF, take it with a grain of salt, but it's nice to hear you give your honest opinion on James Daniels because I have seen his name mentioned to the Dolphins time and time again.
Someone who I think I want the Dolphins to be interested in just because his picture on ESPN, he just looks so angry, and I think the Dolphins need that angriness. Brandon Sheriff, he's only scheduled to make about $7 million, age 33. Hasn't really been a Pro Bowl player after being like a really high pick by the Jaguars. But he's also averaged less than 2 sacks per year. He's played 10 years and over 1,000 snaps in each of the last 3 years. If you want somebody where you can just say like, all right, let's do $6-7 million, set it and forget it, could Sheriff be one of those guys?
Yeah, so I mean, the conversation that we had for Zeitler would be almost the exact same conversation that we have for Sheriff also. The amount of games that he's played in all 17 games over the last 3 seasons, which is, as a guy that's going to be 34 years old, that's really really impressive. You can see that in terms of his movements and stuff like that, he's a shell of what he used to be, his early days in Washington when he was one of the best players in the league. Um, but again, similar to Zeitler, this would be a guy that, if we go through free agency, we go through the draft, and we haven't fixed the guards properly. Another guy that's going to anchor well in the pass game. That's where I would look to sign him as like a third, fourth tier option. And I guess if everything fails, we can always just ignore the guards through free agency and the draft and just come back and go with Zeitler and Sheriff to fill it for a year.
Maybe Evan Mathis will be available.
Oh man, do you have a preference between those two vets? Is there one that you liked more than the other, or have ranked higher than the other?
Yeah, I would probably say that I have Zeitler higher. I think that, like I said, when I envision a left guard, I think that he fits that in a lot of ways. So I think that even with his reduced athleticism, I think that he's got enough short area quickness that he could be a effective left guard. That Zeitler could be an effective left guard in this offense.
This one probably a little bit of a curveball. Former 2020 first round draft pick Jedrick Wills was he was benched during the season for a 4th round rookie. 6'4", 300 pounds. Could this possibly be a player who he struggled throughout his career that the Dolphins could look at? Like maybe right guard, maybe he could be our Mekhi Becton. We follow in the Eagles' footsteps of just finding somebody who's struggled mightily throughout his career. And I mean, struggles as a left tackle, right tackle, maybe move him inside, give him a shot.
So I had Wills rated as the top tackle in that 2020 offensive or 2020 draft. I really liked him a lot. And I'm not sure why it hasn't come together for him. I mean, similar to Teven Jenkins, maybe it's the fact that he plays in the Browns and, things just don't connect. But I think there was also rumors. Wasn't there also rumors that he wouldn't come back or didn't want to come back because of being a impending free agent or something like that?
I think so.
But so there's concerns there. When I was watching film of him earlier, it definitely looked like, he was making business decisions when he was playing. Didn't feel like he was finishing blocks the way that he could. I think the athletic ability is still there. Still moves really well, still has some really high level plays, but there's some other plays that you're just like, what are you doing, man? Like you know, and so I think that for him, um, I think that the interview process, we talk about interviews with rookies all the time, but that interview process for him is going to be huge in terms of how confident a team is that he is willing to put in that effort, that he's not going to, just hide on the bench when things aren't going well, or waiting to get his next contract, that type of thing. The idea of getting him and moving him into guard, if that's something, if he's not getting the offers at tackle, that would certainly be something that I'm interested in. So overall, this is a player that I'm very intrigued by physically and what he can do. But in terms of just having no idea where his head is or what you're going to get, like eh, probably one of the biggest question marks on the list here for me with Wills.
Sounds like a Greer special. Sorry, Josh.
No, you're good, man. He's like a wild. I mean, it sounds like a wild card. I'm glad you brought up just how much he meant to you in that draft class, because I remember a lot of us, doing the mock drafts or just looking at those tackles and feeling like Jedrick Wills, had it all. So I mean, that would be very intriguing to see him come in and potentially move inside. It sounds like something that the Eagles will do, right? His Spotrac market value is $2.2 million. I mean, he seems like a guy that'll sign with the Eagles, and he'll be the next Mekhi Becton for them. But very intrigued by that, Jake. I mean, I'd love to see that happen just because of, again, the potential heading into the draft, just how highly coveted he was.
Now, did we just waste, Eric? Let's be honest here. Let's cut to the chase. Did we just waste 45 minutes just so we can sit here and say the Dolphins are going to pay out of their nose for 2021 second-round pick Aaron Banks from the 49ers? Is it that simple where it's just Shanahan guy, let's get him in here, pay the money, call it a day?
Basically, yeah. I did see that the projection like today I saw was 18 to 20, which is probably a bit rich for me. That one's kind of tough. But he was one of the top. I think he might have been the number 2 guard on my list for free agent guards. I think he has played left guard in this system. He was a second round pick to be the left guard in this system. Like, this is the perfect guy that we're talking about in terms of that mold. He's played well there. I know that seems like a lot of Niners fans have kind of turned on him, but if you go back and look when that happened, a lot of it coincided with when Trent Williams left the lineup, right? And if you go from Trent Williams to the revolving door they had at left tackle, right? We saw in Miami what that can look like. But Aaron Banks, I think, is a very good player. One of the top guards on my free agent list and the top left guard option. I think he's one of the safest decisions you could make. So if we're talking about a guy that's gonna make that 15 million plus, you know, I would be okay with that for Banks. McDaniel's been with this guy. McDaniel knows exactly what you're getting, right? This isn't a guy that we're saying, maybe he can play guard or maybe he can come into the system and play guard. This is going to be, if they make this move, it's because Mike McDaniel has seen this guy play in this system, and Mike McDaniel feels like this guy is a needle mover on the offense.
And that's coming from the same Mike McDaniel that, when he said how he wanted to bolster the skill position players and, overlook. So, I mean, this seems like the guy, right? I had written down the market value was $10 million according to Spotrac. So there's a perfect example of the difference in between, because I did see the reports as well, 15 to 20 million. So if that's what the Dolphins need to do, I mean, I feel like as we talk through this, getting a guy like Aaron Banks started 43 games at guard. He's familiar with the coaching staff, bringing him in, and then maybe at right guard, maybe we see how the draft goes and, get one of these other guys, or we just sign a vet like you mentioned. But Aaron Banks feels like that player that, like you said, if Mike McDaniel feels like he's that guy that can come in, copy and paste, no reason not to do it.
Eric, this has been absolutely awesome for 48 minutes. If everybody, make sure you're following him on Twitter, on X, whatever you call it, OL Coach Smith 63. One final question here. We went through about 10 free agents there, but do you have a heat-seeking thought here about somebody else we haven't brought up yet that might just be the right fit for the Dolphins?
Well, a couple of guys. So Patrick McCarry from the Ravens is actually my top guard in free agency based on the film. I really like the way that he played at guard. He also has a lot of positional versatility. He was actually starting at tackle to begin the year, and then the Ravens wanted to get Roger Rosengarten in the lineup, so they kicked McCarry into guard from there. The reason that I wouldn't have, so I went through, I did my list based on the film, right? And then when I started looking at the different players that had played there before, McCarry has really short arms, 31-inch arms. And maybe they overlooked that because he's got the NFL film to prove that that's not a limitation for him. But I think that could be a reason the Dolphins don't really seriously consider him. And then the other one, like I said, Fries was one of my highest rated right guards, but does have some injury history there. A guy that I had rated a little lower as a right guard is Dylan Radins from the Tennessee Titans, Aaron Brewer's former
Okay.
O-line neighbor. He is also a really good player. A lot of the same stuff that I said about Fries would apply to Radins. A little more consistency in terms of the availability. So when I did my offensive guard review for free agency, my pick for left guard was Aaron Banks, and Radins was the guy that I had for right guard.
That's awesome, man. I don't know what else to say to that, Jake, other than thank you for just doing this and talking offensive line with us, because I feel like I've learned a lot. And just to hear you kind of not so much gush, but just talk about the positions. I mean, you can tell that you know your shit, and it's fun to hear.
Co-host
Appreciate
of
it. I will-
Scouting the Fins. Eric, I just wanted to ask you, when do you go live? When do you record? I'd love to plug that.
So usually Thursday nights. They can be found on both the Five Reasons Sports YouTube channel as well as the 3 Yards Per Carry podcast feed on both of those. But typically Thursday evenings we record live and it's up and available.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for listening to Another Dolphins podcast. And thank you, Eric, so much for joining us. The news cycle never stops. The 24/7 NFL season continues on. We will be back early next week to get you ready with all the tampering that is involved in free agency. But until then, fins up.
Fins up.